All right, so news site 6 is the last one of these news site challenges. And the last thing we're going to do with this is we're going to be making use of React's Context API, which is a way of passing information through the entire React app. So you don't need to pass something through props through 4 layers necessarily. You can just pass it in wherever you want. We're also going to be adding login and logout functionality, very basic login, logout functionality. And as well, we're going to make it so that you can only add an article if the user is logged in using what's called an access token. So right now, the single page authentication should look like something like a single page app, that is. The authentication login flow looks something like this. The user navigates to a login page. They enter their credentials and hit submit, and their login credentials are sent to an API endpoint or web service. The API checks those credentials, and if they're valid, it returns what's called an access token. So the access token is a randomized bit of information that is generated for you by the API endpoint. So you don't have to store like a user's password on the front end. You only just have this access token, which is only good for the session you're in. And any requests made to protected API endpoints always require a user access token. And if a token is not included in a request to a protected endpoint, or the token is expired, a 401 unauthorized response status code is returned. And when any API request is made to the valid token, the token's expiration is extended. If the user is inactive for a certain period of time, the token will expire and the user will be asked to log in again. So that token is what your browser uses to keep you know you're logged in and keep you logged in. It always has this expiration date that will expire if you don't use it. And that's why you get logged out immediately. All right, so for the initial setup for this, if you're using your own code from News Site 5, you'll want to run npm run update app. If not, you just npm install, npm run start. I've already installed, so I'm going to open this up and then do run start. Does anyone have any questions about the concept of the access token, by the way? So I'm just going to close some of these tabs real quick.
Does that have anything to do with the CSRF token in Django?
It is similar, yeah. It's a token that shows that this is a valid request, is what a CSRF token is for. And the access token is specifically to say, and I am a user that has access to this information. So the token kind of operates by similar rules in that it's a randomized bit of code, it's essentially a randomized string that kind of serves as your access point, but it's an additional layer of authentication on top of that. And there's a little more we have to do. All right, so here's news site as it stands today. We've got sections, we've got articles. If I go back to the home page, I can search for Nostrum, and I have this add an article button. If I click that, add some nonsense, hit submit. Something's changed. Now it says authorization required. So we've updated our server, the localhost 3001, to only allow you to add an article if you are logged in. So first we're going to make a new API method called the login method. So if I go here, this user's API already exists, and we already have a login method that takes in a credentials object as an argument. It says here we should create a function. Credentials object will look something like this. So it'll be an email and a password. So we're going to be logging in with john@doe.com, and the password's going to be open sesame. And we want to create a request that's almost identical to the articles API.add function, add article function, that is. All right, so that means we're going to be returning fetch. And our endpoint is going to be localhost 3001/API/users/login include user. So I'm going to copy this URL. All right, and this is going to be a post request. So in addition to the API endpoint, what does our fetch request need in order to be a post request?
Method.
Yep, it needs an object which includes method, which is post. We're going to need headers, which I believe we can always check out articles API.json, .js. So we're going to need content type application JSON, content type application/JSON. Make sure I spelled that correctly because in the past I have misspelled application JSON and that broke everything. All right, and then finally we need the body. And what do we include in the body? What information goes in the body specifically?
Is that the JSON response?
Yep, so that's going to be the actual JSON stuff that we're sending over. And we have this credentials object, which again is going to just look like a dictionary like so. And so we can just call json.stringify on our credentials object. And as we can see, it looks almost exactly like our add article function now. And I believe we have a test suite to make sure it's working the way it's supposed to. So I'm going to npm test here. I'm going to run all the tests. All right, we have one fail, one pass. Articles API, so users API.test.js passed, which means this is working the way it's supposed to. Articles API didn't, but that's because we are going to be changing something up about Articles API later. So any questions about this login method so far? Yeah, it's pretty straightforward as it is right now. And so when we run this is kind of the response we're going to be looking for when we get back. So it's going to give us an ID, a TTL, created, user ID, and user information. The ID is specifically what our access token is. So this is the information we really want to get out of our login thing. If we have this, it means we have successfully logged in. So here we'll want to call the users API.login from src/pages/login page. While we could technically house the user information in the state of the app.js and pass it down to all the child components via props, because login information is relevant everywhere, that can get messy and as the application grows over time. So instead, we're going to be using React's context API. So this is a way of passing data through the component tree without having to go through props to props to props to props. They're generally created and used to store information that everything happens. So things like user information, also things like, okay, whether you're in light mode or dark mode and stuff like that. So we're going to be creating user context so they can be accessed by child components. So I'm going to make a new folder in src and call it contexts. And inside that, I'm going to make a file, usercontext.js. So we're going to have to import something called create context from React. And then we do this create user context, which equals create context. And then inside of that, we have an object with a user set to null by default and an anonymous function called setUser, which for now is going to be just nothing. So const user context equals create context. User is now null. And setUser is just a function that does nothing. And then I'm going to export default user context. So essentially, this allows me to, this user context from the create context library is going to have a lot of information that allows me to pass things on to other components. And we'll see how that works now. So the context object has two components. It has a provider and a consumer. And since we want to provide this user context to the rest of our application, we need to import the user context into app.js. And then we're going to wrap all of our app nav and our routes in the provider. So the provider is going to put everything inside of it. It's going to say have access to the user context. So in app.js, get one more thing to import. Import user context from /pages, not pages, contexts /user context. And then all of this stuff, I'm gonna wrap it up in our user context.provider. And then as we can see here, it says we need to give it a value, which equals user is this.state.user, and setUser is going to be this.setUser. So that means we need to have a something in state called user. So I'm going to set state up here. User is going to be null. And then I'm going to say value equals, so user going to be this.state.user, and setUser is going to be this.setUser. All right, so make sure nothing is broken. So I go back to my home page. All right, so far we haven't really seen the functionality yet. So the shape of the object has to match the object used to create the context, which is an object with a user and a setUser thing. And so it says here, these values will be coming from app.js's state. So we added state to the app class. And we need to create a class method in app.js that accepts a user object as a parameter and sets it into state. And then we can pass that method into our login page when we make it. So I'm going to make a method called handle login that just sets state. Handle login takes in a user. And say this.setState. User is now going to be user.
I have a question, Noah.
Yeah.
For the place where you create the context component a little bit farther down, I noticed you use double braces. Is that because you can insert more than one thing, or is that just the syntax for the context thing?
That's the syntax, because I'm essentially giving it an object with one key called user, which points to the states user, and one called set user, which points to the context set user. So yeah, I believe it takes in an object as an argument that can have multiple key value pairs.
Oh, okay. So the first set of braces is for the JavaScript, and then the second one is for the object.
I believe so, yes.
All right, thank you.
No problem. Does anyone have any other questions about the user context so far? Which I know, again, we're not really seeing it much in action,
Could you just explain a little bit more on the provider thing?
Mhm. Yeah, so the user context provider, and it literally provides the context to everything inside of it. So essentially, this provider says, all right, app nav and everything listed in my routes here are all going to have access to into the context saved by user context. And that's what provider does. And later we're going to be using the receiver, I believe that's the word for it, receiver, that's actually going to allow us to access it.
Or is it the consumer?
Consumer, thank you.
So is that the reason why that's on the very outermost layer, like even above app nav and route, has to be like everything this thing is providing for has to be wrapped within this element?
Exactly.
All right, thank you.
So go ahead. So if you don't, you could, so the reason, yeah, you're exactly right. The provider is wrapped around everything is because we want to give the option to pass the user context down to all those different components. You can pass just the user context to an individual component just by wrapping the individual component with that context provider. But because we want to give access the user, we want the user to be accessible in every component, we wrap the entire, all the components wrapped in it.
Yep.
Oh, I see. So that's like kind of more powerful props, if I can put it that way. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a way of centralizing some information so that you can just pass it to everything.
Hey, Noah.
Yeah.
The user context, could that be named anything, or is that a special thing? Because we named our file user context. Is that getting the context from the user context.js?
Good question. I believe we could name this anything we want. I don't think it's there's a naming convention that I know of, but I like to be clear. So yeah, so I've got user context.js, and then I've got my user context object that I've created. And those are two separate things, but I think I could probably change the name as long as I'm consistent with how I access it.
Okay, but user context is a built-in component in React?
No, create context is. User context is something I've made.
Oh, I mean back on line 27-ish on app.js. Yeah, or line 28.
Yeah, so user context is the thing I created in user context.js, but
Okay.
.provider is built in.
Okay, and
No,
anything wrapped in this is going to require authorization.
It's going to have access to our user object, which will tell us if we're authorized. Chris,
Okay.
were you just saying something?
I was gonna ask you to go back to your user context, the thing that you're importing. So right here, that create context thing, it's coming from React. That is what's you're creating like a your own custom provider.
Mm-hmm.
So Noah's named it user context, and the .provider is coming from the thing that create context builds. It gives back. It's giving you back this object. You've named it user context, but you can do .provider off of that. You could have named it anything you want, but you can always do .provider because create context is returning you back like a provider object, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you can name it anything you want, basically. I'm just repeating the same thing. I don't know if that helps clear it up at all, but that thing is from React. So that is built in React, but it's allowing you to define your own provider, which Noah called user context.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. So you're defining your own component basically as user context.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
then,
it's kind of like piggybacking on a built-in component and adding some extras to it.
Yeah,
and then you're calling the provider component on that. Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right, good. Any other questions? Actually, I believe this.setUser should be this.handleLogin. Because I'm passing in this function and I'm passing it in as setUser. All right. So in order to use this properly, we're going to have to change how we do some of our routing. So up until now, the routes have always used two props, path and component. And we're going to be continuing to use path to define the route, because you need that in order to tell it where to go. But now we're going to be using a new prop called render, which allows us to pass in data and specific props into our components or in the routes they display. So essentially, right now we've got a login page route right here that takes in path and the component. And we're going to write a new method called render login page. So I'm going to put that inside my render method. Make another method called const render login page. And it's going to and it takes in props as an argument. It's going to return our login page. And we're going to give it history, props.history, and the handle login function with this.handle login. So history equals props.history, and handle login equals this.handle login. So essentially, this method allows us to pass specific props into a route, which we can't normally do. And now instead of component equals login page, I'm going to change it to be render equals render login page. Did I spell that right? Yep. So that allows me to give this login page access to history and the login function. All right, so if we take a look at our login page right now, I think we should be able to see that in action a little bit. So if I inspect this and go to my components, and I've got my login page here. So now it has access to history, but I think other things wouldn't necessarily have access to it. And we've got this handle login function as well. All right, and we look at the code for our login page. Let's see what it looks like right now. So right now we've got a handle form submit, which we have our event.prevent default, and we console.log things from the form. We've got our form here that has our, it's nicely styled. It's got labels for email and password. So right now, if I just, do john@doe.com and open Sesame, look at the console, it should console.log that for us. So now we want to make this so we can actually utilize our login method. So first I am going to import users API from /API/users API.js. And I want to make sure, if I look at my login method, again, it takes a credentials object. So instead of just console.logging these, I want to add these to an object. So I could call this one credentials object. Object. It's going to equal an object. And we'll say that we have email, which is set to event.target.element0.value. And it's going to have a password set to event.target.elements1.value. So we want to invoke our users API.login method. And then we'll have a callback function. And it says right here, we'll have a .then. And we'll say, call the function you passed into the login page, this.props.handle login. and then we'll pass in the response from the API, and then we'll redirect back to the home page. So we'll call on users API.login with our credentials object. And then we'll say .then. We have response. We'll do response.json. And then we'll say .then. We'll call this user. And we'll use our props.handle, this.props.handle, this.props. What did we call it? Was it just login, handle login? Handle login. Handle login, and that took our user object as an argument. And then we'll also say this.props.history.push. And we're going back to the home page. So we're doing with a slash there. So let's see if it works before we take a closer look at it. So again, john@doe.com, open Sesame. All right, so it redirected us successfully. We don't have any errors except for the key prop. Let's see if our user got set in state. So I go to my app. In here, I've got a user object in state. I've got I've got the ID. So this is our token. And we've got the user, email, ID, all of that stuff. So that means we have successfully logged in. React now has access to this user object, which is exactly what we wanted. So what questions do you have about how we logged in?
Could you go back to the user context page for me, Noah?
Definitely.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Right. So no other questions about, so we're able to pass in handle login to our login page. And we're able to use that method to set state here. So now we have access to our user, which lets us know that we're still logged in. Okay. All right, so now we want to make it so that we've already set it so that we can't actually add an article unless we're logged in. That's like on the back end. Now we need to make sure that the front end can actually, we can only ever do that if we're logged. We can only add an article if we are authenticated. So first we're going to update add article so that it takes a second argument called token. It's going to articles API. It's going to take a token as an argument. It says when an API endpoint requires authorization or authentication, it's customary to provide this data via a header called authorization. So I'm going to add here a second header called authorization. And that's going to be our token. So now in order for this function to work, we're going to have to pass it this token as an argument. And now it says here we have a unit test to check that this new behavior works. So I'm going to run npm test again. And all of our tests passed. So now add article works as it should because it will now take a user token there that'll send up as authorization in the headers to let us know that this is an authenticated user. All right, so now we need to make it so that our our article page will be able to use context in order to actually get access to our token so that it'll allow us to actually add an article. All right, so the way it is right now, we've got something called state, redirect is set to false. We've got our handle form submit, which at the moment is an asynchronous function. We prevent default, create an article object. We use our add article here. If response.status equals 200, that means it worked. We redirect to true. Else, we response.json and we set an alert for an error message. And then we also have this thing here that says if state.redirect, we redirect to the home page. All right, so I'm going to do a few things here. I'm going to say, in order to give it access to my, I think I need to import the context, I believe. So import user context from /contexts/user context. And at the bottom, I'm going to say add article page dot context type equals user context. And then up here, after I prevent the default, I want to say let user equal, I now have access to something called this.context. And then out of the user, I'm going to get a token, and that's going to be user.user.id. I believe if we take a look at our React app again, components and state, we're not logged in anymore. We're expired. So I do /login again. Password is Open Sesame. So we have our user object, which has a key called user, and that has a key called ID. So if you wanted to get to the email, we'd have to do user.user.user.user. So now our token is our user.user.id. So our article object can remain the same. We're still getting the same values here. And now add article takes the second object argument, which is going to be our token. All right, so now we can try it out. So go to /add article. If I do a bunch of nonsense here, let's see if it works. Uh-oh. All right, so we had a problem. Unhandled rejection, cannot read property ID of null. All right, so it looks like we had a problem here. Looks like if I'm understanding this correctly, our user is no longer saved. So it logged us out already, which seems odd. I'm going to try this one more time. And if not, there's maybe something I did wrong here. One sec. john@doe.com. Password is Open Sesame. Oh, I think it's because I typed it in instead of clicking on the link. Yeah, that's why. So right now, there's nothing saving the token if we refresh the page. All right, so I did a bunch of nonsense. And there it is. So right now, if I type in another URL, the state will be cleared. So later on, we'll have a way of storing that in between sessions. But right now, I have to click on this add an article function if I want to stay logged in so that I can actually add an article. what questions do you have about how we changed our add article page?
Could you explain at the very bottom what's going on there with the context?
Mhm.
Yeah, there.
Yeah. So I believe, if I'm understanding this correctly, if I got rid of user context there, went to add article, if I try typing this in, let's see what happens. All right, we get our, again, cannot read property ID of undefined. I don't think we'd have access to this .context in the same way, if I'm understanding this correctly. So we have something called static context undefined here. And if I do that and refresh the page, all right, static context is still undefined, so maybe I'm misunderstanding that. But yes,
Oh no, so that create content, is that what you're asking at the very end?
the
Yeah,
context type equals user context.
Yep. So that just gives us access to the most like the nearest user, the nearest context that we're passing in. So with this, you can only access one context in this app or in this component right now. So that just essentially gives us access to the user context inside of the add article page. There's another way you can do it too, and we have it in the docs or in our curriculum.
Yep.
However, it's kind of hard. You have to manually pass that into the form to have access to the user inside the handle submit article function.
Yeah. So
this is an alternative way to do it.
yeah, this is an alternative way to do it that I found easier, but the other way is shown right here. So this is where you'd use a user context.consumer. This is the other way of doing it, and then you essentially wrap up your entire rendering here inside this kind of user context method. So I personally find that the just adding context type at the bottom here is easier, but it's worth trying it both ways.
Yeah, and again, this is specifically for a class-based component, and as React moves towards functional-based components, passing in a user context or context into a functional component is a little bit easier.
Yeah, there's a hook called use context, which is quite simple to use. So I'm not going to go over that here because I want you to have the chance to try it out on your own. But it's a lot simpler than what we did here, actually. Yeah, it actually mentions it here. There's the use context hook. Great. Any other questions about using authorization here? Have we actually, sorry, before I know I just asked a question, but also, have we talked about the difference between authorization and authentication yet?
No.
Okay, so this is a concept that I'd like to just go over real quick. They're two related subjects, so I'll just put a note right here. So authorization and authentication. So authentication is what happens when you log in to an application, and it's a way of verifying your identity. So verifying that you are who you say you are. So whenever you create an account and then log in, that's authentication. Authorization is saying, okay, once you've proved who you are, is how much access you have to information. So like level of access based on your authentication. So the way we have this set up right now is when we log in, that's authentication. When we try to add an article and it checks to see if we're logged in, that's authorization, saying only an authorized user is allowed to add an article. And if you're not authorized, you can't do that. All right, so now any other
Is that-
questions? Yes?
so- Is that kind of what an API key is? It's your token that lets you access these functions within this API you're using?
Yes, so your API key is both your authentication and authorization to access an API. It's saying that you are a verified person who has access to this. Like it says, I am who I say I am, and here's my key saying I'm allowed to have access to this information from this API. All right. So now we're going to change some things in AppNav. So we want to make sure that users who aren't logged in should only have the Add Article button appear if they are logged in. So this shouldn't appear if you're not logged in. So let's try doing the AppNav the way it has in the documentation. If I can find the AppNav. Components, AppNav, appnav.js. So I'm going to import user context from /context/user context.js. So in my render here, it says return. Inside of that, I'm going to say user context.consumer. I'm going to cut all of this and paste it inside. And then I need to have this user context as an arrow function here. So user context. And then I guess I cut and paste again, get all of this inside of that function right here. Like so. All right, it's not breaking yet. That's a good sign. So now we should have access to our user context. So if I got to figure out a way how to check that real quick, because you can't really console.log while you're inside of this, can you? Well, I know I want to get rid of, I want this right here to be conditionally rendered depending on whether or not I have my user. So let's try it like this. It's going to say user context. So if there is user context, we want to this is what we want to render. Else, we'll just go null. So I have a ternary operator here saying if I do user context.user, I should say, if a user is present, I want to render this add an article link. If not, I want to render nothing. All right. Oops. So I'm on add article. If I go to here, all right, it's not showing up. I'm going to go to /login. I'm going to log myself in. Password is open sesame. And now my add article button has magically appeared because I am now authenticated and authorized. Yep. So using the user context.consumer method, you put everything inside of these brackets with user context kind of doing an arrow function here. And then user context allows you access to things like user context.user within this. And we can also, do some additional things. Like, for example, we could have, if you're not logged in, there should also be a login page. So maybe instead of that, I'll have another link to equals/login. Oh, this should also be inside of a nav item. login. So now if I go back to the home page, we've got a login button. If I follow that link and log in, it instead renders the add article page. All right, what questions do you have about this conditional rendering based on context?
Where's your token coming from? Again, Noah, can you go over where that's being passed in and everything right now?
So when I logged in, I had a method passed down through to the login page that would update state here. So I've got something right here called user, and this is also added to context. Yeah, so I can see here's my context provider. When I updated that, my user was set. So now I have something called context.user here.
Got it.
And so that here's my token, and I also have, ID and a username. So I could also, there's a lot of cool stuff I can do with that now that I have access to that information.
Hey Noah, could you go back to the root app.js to take a look at what's going on there?
Sure.
So basically the flow is that you log in and you have a state set on app.js, and then you pass that state down using the provider. Is that correct?
Yep. So I have, in my app, I've got user and state, and I've also got this handle login function, which is my set state. And then I pass those in as value to my user context provider. And this user context provider essentially allows it to distribute that to everything else.
Okay.
Without having to go saying, okay, state passes in user as props to everything, and every one of those passes that down as props to all their other components. Instead, they just need to get access to my user context.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem.
Noah, to follow up on that, could you go over how, because looking at your user context, can you go to your user context tab?
Yep.
So in there, that's an object with the user and set user. So that's like, that looks similar to your set state, your set, and then back in app.js, when you call it in the prop, so it's going to set the user in that user context file to this .state.user, and it's going to set user to that that function,
Exactly.
which
So,
that function then is.
And that function is this handle login function right here.
Okay, so I guess I'm confused where the original value from user comes from if you don't ever get. So it's just null. It's going to be null initially.
Yeah, so it'll start out as null, and then whenever we update it, we will make sure that that is updated both in app.app state and also in the user context provider. It's kind of done automatically.
Okay.
All right.
And if you research more about or the use context, there's other ways to create that user context and pass it down. But this is the most simplest way, like the basic way of how to do it.
Is this just the class way, or will we do something else for functional?
You'll be doing something to create the use context is the same, but how you pass it down to a functional component is a little bit different. Okay. It's actually easier.
All right, so it says here that in addition to making an add article button appear only when appropriate, we're going to add login, which I already did, and log out links to the navigation. So in my app nav, So in addition to my add article here, I also want to do a link to a logout. Link to equals / logout. Have that say logout. And we, in order to use the logout, essentially what the behavior we're going to be using here is it's going to just be a button, and it's just going to make sure that the user is set to null, and then it's going to redirect us to the login page. So back in app.js, I need to make another route. And I'm also going to make a method kind of like my render login page here to add some additional functionality to that route. Because I don't actually want to render a new component when I log out. I just want some behavior to happen. So I'm going to call this one render logout. And we're going to return. Actually, we're not even going to return anything. And I don't think we're even going to take, we still need to take props, okay. So we're going to say this.setState. User is going to be now be null again. So I'm just clearing out the user from state, which also clears it out in the context. And then I'm going to return a redirect. And that redirect is going to take us to the login page. And then I'm going to set up my route here, saying route exact path equals / logout. And my render is going to equal render logout. Redirect is not defined, so I think it looks like I need to import that. I believe that would be, where do you import redirect from? Is that
React Router DOM.
React Router DOM, thank you. So, and redirect. There we go. So we import redirect from React Router DOM, like so. So I'm going to log in one more time. So these are not very neat looking, but we have add an article. If I hit log out, let me open up. It's not letting me see the components right now, but if I log out, you can see right here that we can't be logged in anymore because it's showing the login button instead of the log out and add article buttons. So again, render logout is a function that all it does is set state of the user to null and then redirects us to the login page. And then our route says we have a route that takes us to logout, and the render equals render logout. So instead of actually rendering a component, it just we kind of hijack that and use other behavior instead. Great. What questions do you have about News Site 6?
I have one question, Noah. Earlier, we talked about from this login page, we successfully log in and we'll change the state in app.js. Could you show me how that's done, the code that does that? How to go to the login page to change the state in?
For sure. So in app.js, we've got our handle login function. And when we have this function inside our render called render login page, we're specifically passing in handle login as a prop. So that gives the login page access to handle login, this function here. And then in the login page, we have our form submission. We create a credentials object, use our user's API login. And then we pass in the user object we get from that login to this.props.handle login, which again comes from our app.js. And all that does is it takes the user and sets that as set state. So in this case, this login page is actually not using context. We could use context as well, but in this case, we just decided to pass it in directly as props.
Okay. Could you drag it down a little bit? Scroll down on the app.js.
Yeah, so in order to use that render logout, or log in, I said, so you get our route exact, the path is still /login, but instead of a component, we say render equals render login page. That function we just made.
All right, thank you. Probably need to look more into the code after. Will this be posted by any chance?
Yeah, so that's all in this. This stuff is all here in the new site 6.
Okay, thank you.
No, I have a question about individual projects. So are we gonna, is this what we're gonna be doing to authenticate to the Django database? And then is
This
that
is
gonna be,
half of it.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say, yeah, this is half of it. You're going, you will be accessing your API, your Django API that you make through this way. That's something we're covering next week, is going to be how to actually handle that on the back end of generating a user token and all through Django and stuff like that. But yeah, in general, that's how it works. And one thing we haven't covered today is another thing we'll cover next week, is how to make sure that you stay logged in through page refreshes, so that so that you can hold on to that state even if you exit another page and come back again.
Okay.
So I know people were asking, are we going to teach Redux, which is a state management tool? Essentially, context and another React hook called use reducer kind of replace Redux, but we're not going to get into the use reducer aspect of it. But essentially, the context does that for us.
Yeah.
It enables us to pass state down to whatever component we want in the tree.
Yeah, it's very useful that way. Redux is also very powerful in the ways it does that, but in order to use Redux, we'd have to change everything about how we structure this application. So it's like, I feel like if we were teaching Redux, we should be teaching it from the beginning of React and teaching them side by side, because I think otherwise we would have to, like, all of this stuff would just be completely thrown out the window almost.
A whole nother beast.
All right, I'm going to stop recording.